Okay, so recording is started. Um, I am recording this actually on Wednesday, rather than my normal Monday time frame. Mostly because nobody was going to be here anyways, and also I wanted to take a little bit of extra time to prepare for this one because honestly, so we're going over Genesis chapter 26. And honestly, in my opinion, this is kind of a weird chapter. Um, and I'll probably be harping on that throughout the chapter, but there's a lot of things weird, um, just with the structure, the ordering of when it comes into place. Um, and it's also weird because uh this is kind of the first chapter where throughout it, Abraham is kind of a main character. Or sorry, not Abraham. Look, messed it up. Isaac is a main character. And actually that kind of helps my point. There's so few places where Isaac is a main character in the story. Um of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Isaac is definitely he gets the least amount of screen time. Um, Actually, Jacob probably gets the most. After this, we're about to get roughly 10 chapters that's strictly about Jacob. And we had roughly the same amount of time that was about Abraham. Um, and so this is about all we get for Isaac. Isaac is mostly a supporting character in both of their stories. So I'm going to be doing kind of more speculation in this chapter about what we can draw out of it, than really probably you should do. But mostly because I really want to see what the Bible says about Isaac, and we'll of course be doing that because he does show up again in later chapters, but he's there he's there as a side character. Um, uh, but there will be some things that I want to note specifically about Isaac. So let's start off.
Chapter 26. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not get down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.
Okay, so that first paragraph is really interesting, but it's so w- w- we're now at a point where um Isaac has come into his own. Isaac is an adult. Isaac has his own family. He has his own kids. Um, but Isaac is going to mimic and model the life of Abraham now. And we talked about how Abraham's life mimics and models the life of Israel. Um, as a country, right? As a nation, as a people group, right? The going down to Egypt. And so this story is meant to be, yes, it's that same pattern, which I kind of think of as a resurrection pattern, right? Ultimately, because the ultimate fulfillment of this pattern is the pattern of Christ's resurrection, of going down into death and coming back out. And so Isaac is about to follow that same pattern. Um, but as a part of that, we as he's doing that, we have Kind of an opposite call, right? Because originally, because he's already in the land, right? So Abraham wasn't in the land, and so God had to call Abraham to the land. And so in this one, God is calling Isaac to not go, right? He's saying, don't go there, right? Stay in the land. And so again, we have this emphasis on the land, which we often miss, but it's the reestablishing of the covenant with the next son, right? So establishing the covenant with the son of the promise, right? And it should be emphasized that this conversation is not being had with Ishmael, right? It's being had with Isaac, right? So you have this idea of just because, right, which we talked a little bit about last time with like birthright and blessing. Just because something was like promised, like in the past, it gets re-promised, it gets re-emphasized at a later time. Just because something was promised to Abraham, Isaac is going to also need that promise reinforced to him. And so you have this idea of reinforcing the promise, right? Which is a thing that gets gets picked up later of of do these things to reinforce the promise, right? And one of those things that you do is you set up memorials, right? And so you'll have this after they cross the Jordan River and all these different instances where it's like where God is like set up a memorial here, and it'll say, well, why are we doing this? So that when you bring your children by and your children ask, why is that rock there? You can be like, that rock is there because our people did this and this and this and this, right? You're making memories, if it were, right? And this is why it's like, oh, why do you go on vacation and you take pictures and stuff? You're making memories. God is making memories, right, with his people, and he's establishing them in the land, right? Because that's what they're promised, right? We're staking things out. um, I also think that it's interesting that you have this line here about because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. That's really interesting to me because what commandments, what statutes, what laws? Remember, the Torah is not written yet, and we don't really have any indication as to what those are, but there's an implication that, well, that Abraham knew in some capacity what those were. But it would be interesting because, as we've already referenced last time when we talked about Hesed, uh Abraham was clearly not keeping the law because he was married to his half sister, which is explicitly against the law. So, like, what is God talking about here? We don't get any further explanation, so we don't fully know. But there's some kind of implicit the way that I read it is that there's some kind of implicit law, implicit objective morality that you're supposed to be following. There's an implicit goodness, which also we know because of a similar story of whenever Abraham was dealing with Abimelech, that he wasn't really doing everything properly. So it's honestly kind of a weird statement from God, especially considering that there's no ordinances yet for um atonement. There's no ordinances for forgiveness. Like, how was Abraham forgiven for all of the kind of terrible things that he did um in Egypt, or that he did um in his relationship with Abimelech? Well, we kind of see that it's kind of attributed to him in some way. In some way, God is attributing it to him. And we can clearly see that in this at this standpoint, it's kind of hard to make clear black and white distinctions of like, oh, Abraham was following the law. It's like he didn't have the law yet. How are you making these claims that a lot of people want to say, well, it's attributed to him? Well, this is one of the things where this is where later authors like Paul is going to do a retroactive thing and be like, it's attributed to him as righteousness by the virtue of Christ. Like by the virtue of Christ who came later, it gets attributed back to Abraham. Like that faith that he had looking forward, that righteousness is attributed back to him retroactively. And so that's why you can say things like, even though the saints of the Old Testament they're not saved by works. They are saved by Christ. They just didn't know who Christ was yet. And this is where you get into the thing of like, this is why I say of oh, is it possible that there are people who have never heard of Christ that are still saved, but like the people that are unevangelized, the problem of the unevangelized. I'm like, it is possible that there are some amongst the unevangelized that they are saved. They are not saved independent of Christ. They are saved because of Christ. It's just that they had a faith that was unassigned and that they didn't know who to apply it to. Now, how many people does that actually apply to? I think very, very few. And so we should still go and evangelize. How am I getting to that conclusion of very, very few? Well, look at our model for that to come to that conclusion, Abraham and Isaac. What percentage are Abraham and Isaac to the rest of the world at their times? Very, very few, right? And so if there are any in the unevangelized world, there are very, very few, and so we should still feel the impetus to go and evangelize to those people, even if it is theoretically possible. Does that make sense? Okay, so as I stated, we're about to have this scene with Isaac and Abimelech where he's going to model what happened with Abraham and Abimelech earlier. So let's do a bit of like, before we get into that, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Every commentary that I have read, and this is part of the reason why I took a couple of extra days to look up more commentaries than what I normally do. Every commentary seems to think that this Abimelech is a different Abimelech than the one that showed up with the story with Abraham. Now, the reason why they do this is because there's a lot of scholars that think Abimelech is a title, meaning because it has that same like key, like my God is whatever. And actually, if we go to Step Bible real quick, I forget exactly what it means. If we go to Genesis 26 in Step Bible, and we click in Abimelech, yeah, my father is king, right? Because Abimelech means like my father is king. That's why people think it's like a hereditary, that name is more of a hereditary title. The issue that I have with this, which I have seen no one discuss, and it honestly upsets me a little bit that I wasn't able to find anybody about this. Later on in the chapter, it makes a reference to Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his armies, which, if you remember back in the story, with Abraham and Abimelech, Phicol is there too. It makes another reference to Phicol, the commander of Abimelech's armies. Well, I don't see anybody talking about that Phicol is a hereditary term. And also, clearly, that's a different person. And so, is the implication that Phicol is still alive, but it's a different Abimelech? Or is the Abimelech, or like, is it the same Phicol? I would assume that it's the same Phicol. So what kind of time frame are we talking about here? Well, that first story with Abimelech and Abraham happened prior. It happened the year prior to Isaac's birth. This is now happening with Isaac being fully grown. We don't know how fully grown, but it's happening while Isaac is fully grown. We do know that we've already had a story and of of uh, Jacob and Esau after they are somewhat grown. We don't know how grown they are. I take that story as them being teenagers of some age, but we don't really know. And I take that as being teenagers of some age because it's prior to them talking about them being married. Although um, uh, we're going to end this one with a verse about Esau being 40 years old whenever he takes his marriage. And so it's really this is part of the thing where I talked about it's really confusing about structures. It's really confusing as to when this story took place. Because if you remember, Isaac marries Rebekah whenever he's 40, has Jacob and Esau whenever he's 60. But then we have a story about Jacob and Esau um, taking place whenever prior to their marriage. We learn that Esau marries whenever he's 40. So that means that Esau is marrying whenever Isaac is 100. If this has to take place at least after, like if we're assuming chronology in these stories, it looks like Isaac is at least roughly 80, right? Whenever this story is taking place, because has the kids whenever he's 60. You have the story about the kids whenever they're roughly in their teens. 20 years after that, roughly, Esau is going to get married. And so this story seems to come down roughly in the middle of that. So it looks like this is happening roughly whenever Isaac is 80, which means that it's 80 years from the previous Abimelech. So do we think that? So yeah, okay, that makes sense as to why you would think it's a different Abimelech because it's 80 years later. But if all of these people are having lifespans roughly equivalent to lifespans of what people at the time are thinking here, right? Especially if you think that this is like, if you believe in that the lifespans are tied to deteriorating genetics, you would think that these long lifespans would be applying to everything and that they're not just numbers that biblical writers are using, which I do tend to think that it's numbers that biblical writers are just using. But regardless of how the authors are thinking, I think it's totally conceivable that it's the same Abimelech. And it seems conceivable that it's the same Phicol. But a lot of people are like, oh no, they take it for granted that it's a different one. Does that have any significance? Well, a little bit, because it would have some significance as partially to what's going to happen in their story of what Abimelech's character is and maybe why Abimelech does the different things that he does in this story. All right, so now that I've gone through a lot of that background, let's do the actual story. Here we go.
So Isaac settled it. When one of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." Or he feared to say, "my wife," thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say, 'She is my sister'?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought, lest I die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death."
Okay. So we have Isaac repeating the sins of his father. Um, we don't know if he learned this trick from his father, or if it was just a thing that savvy sojourners learned in their experience. We don't know. Um, we also have the fact that this is a full outright lie rather than kind of a half lie, because remember, Sarah was Abraham's half sister. Rebecca is not Isaac's half sister, so he doesn't get that gray area wiggle room. This is just a straight lie. Um, uh, but again, it's repeating the same pattern. Um, but it's but the verse that I want to highlight here is Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. What does Isaac's name mean?
Laughter.
Laughter. And so in the Hebrew, literally what it is Isaac was like Isaacing with his wife. And some translations actually translate laughing, and they translate it very differently. Some of them translate it as caressing, some translate it as fondling, others as playing. I believe the King James translates it as making sport with. And so it's one of the things where I actually like the ESV's translation the most because it ties it back to laughter. But one of the commentaries that I saw really took it as that, like, Isaac was doing some sort of PDA with Rebecca, and that's kind of the signal to Abimelech that, like, whoa, that's not your sister, like, that's your wife. But part of me thinks that, well, maybe the reason why he was wary of this and was looking out for this is because of his previous experience with Abraham, and he is like, oh, these sojourners from these, they're a shifty bunch. They tend to do this kind of a thing. I'm going to look out for them. That makes a little bit of sense to me. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight with this, I think that sentence, Isaac was Isaacing with his wife. I want to harp on that because I think that that's actually a really, like, significant sentence, and it's a significant thing. And this is where I said that I'm going to spend probably too much time than you should, and probably be reading a little bit too much into the text than you should. I'm going to do that right now. Isaac is the only patriarch whose name is not changed. Abram becomes Abraham. Jacob is going to become Israel. Both of their name changes are name changes where it takes and you can actually see this in, as far as I'm aware, almost all of the name changes that take place in the Bible. It takes the core of what the name is and it points it upwards and towards God, right? Abram, I believe, means like the father of many. Abraham is like the father of a multitude, or the father of nations, right? So it's an elevation up, like towards God, right? Sarah to Sarai is like from like princess to like noble lady, right? It's an elevation up. Jacob is usurper, right? So the one who, like, a usurper is one who struggles with the power structure that's above him, right? That's what a usurper is. It's trying to take over the one who is above you. right? Right. That's why it's heel grabber. He's trying to grab and take the place of the one who's stronger than him. And it changes to Israel struggling with God, right? So no longer struggling with the man that's above him, now struggling with the God who is above all, right?
Yeah.
So it's all of this trajectory. Isaac is the only one whose name isn't changed. Isaac means laughter. He is called that because of the laughter. And it's interesting to see how laughter plays a role throughout Isaac's life, right? His name is laughter because of the joy and the laughter and the ridiculousness of his birth, the ridiculousness of his existence even being there. It plays a role in his relationship with Ishmael because Ishmael and uh, Hagar. I was gonna say Haggai, but Haggai is Greek for holy. I was like, that's not her name. Hagar. Uh, um, they are removed from Abraham's presence because of their scornful laughter towards Isaac, right? So you have that like negative form of laughter towards Isaac, which that helps mold Isaac's life. And then now, in the midst of Isaac doing his sin, right? And actually, if this story wasn't in there, we would have almost no stories of Isaac ever messing up, which is kind of the reason why I think it's a little bit in there, is because like we need a story about all of the patriarchs messing up. We can't just have one good guy, but like Isaac kind of is the most good guy of all of them. But in this story of him messing up, what is the thing that gets him out of this situation? It's him being kind of true to his name. Him being true to his name and his laughter, his character, gets him out of the situation. Okay. In this similar situation with Abimelech, earlier with Abraham, what gets Abraham out of the situation? Do you remember?
Well, I mean, it's them figuring out it's his wife.
Right, but how does Abimelech figure out that it's his wife?
God. Like,
God
does
tells them.
something.
Yes, God tells Abimelech in a dream.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm trying to do right now is I want to tie these two different ideas together. I want to tie the idea of God going before you, God validating you, God being kind of your advocate and your defender, with the idea of you staying and acting true to your name. I want those two ideas to be tied together. Okay. And because those are functioning, and I also want to I want to make this point in light of, because I know Evan will end up seeing this later because he's one of the few people that actually watches. Because Evan made the point of, whenever we're going through this story, of when going down into death, you hide your kind of true identity or your most relevant identity. And that's a way that you can navigate those murky waters through death and try and come out of it. And what I want to say is that, yes, that is a way that you can do that. But ultimately, what you're going to do and the way that you are ultimately going to get out of it is you need to remain true to, and I want these to be equivalent statements. Ultimately, you need to remain true to who you are supposed to be, and you need to rely on God. Like I am trying. I want
like
to tie. I want those to be. Those are ultimately going to be the same thing, and how those are ultimately same thing is that your name ultimately comes from God, right? You might have these other names and stuff, but you have a true name, and that true name comes from God, and you need to remain true to that. And so I don't want it to be. I don't want this to be a sermon about, oh, be yourself in
Yeah,
a
yeah.
modern context of be yourself, which gets misinterpreted as do whatever you want. It's not
do
that.
what God
Do
made you
what
to
God made you to do. Do what God is intending you to do. And that's going to look slightly different for different people, right? Because different people are made differently. Not everyone is Isaac. Not everyone can get by through life by laughter. Some people are going to struggle, like Jacob is going to struggle. But God made you in a way, and you need to figure out how to reconcile that with God. And you need to stick to your strengths when you are in your times of trouble, when you are in your times of distress, and when you are going through death in some capacity, metaphorical, literal, or otherwise. You need to remain true to that. And God will be with you, and God will go before you, and God will deliver you out of that situation. And so you could say that in this story, right? Because God doesn't actually show up in this story, right? He's never mentioned, kind of like in the Ruth story. God's not really mentioned. In the story of finding Isaac's wife, God, right? We had this before where like Abraham's like, the angel of the Lord will go before you. But we never saw any angel, but God made it happen, right? We don't see God working, but the thing that delivers Isaac out of this situation, that saves Isaac from his own sin, is him Isaacing with his wife. Okay. And that's the thing that I want to like highlight there. The other thing that I want to highlight is again the same theme that we have of what have you done to us? One of the people might have laid with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us, right? Not that, like, there is this idea of that there are morally wrong things, like, in that this would have brought guilt upon us had we done this detestable thing, right? And so, it, I emphasize that just to be like, it's not a strict divine command theory thing. Like there stuff can be wrong without there being an explicit law, which we've already seen throughout this chapter. All right, let's keep going.
And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we."
Okay, so again, we're seeing that same pattern. Goes down into death, performs a bit of trickery to try and avoid the harshness of death, is delivered ultimately by God, um, and then coming out of that gains great possessions, gains material glory. Okay, and this happened. Uh, this happened with Abraham, right? Material glory of treasures. It's going to happen with the Israelites as they come out of Egypt. They're going to come out with treasures. And remember that this is a resurrection pattern. So in that resurrection pattern, as Jesus comes out of death, what is the material glory that Jesus comes out of death with?
Well, he has a new body, but he
His-
also ends up getting us.
I would say that it's his resurrection body.
Oh.
His resurrection body is the material glory.
Mm.
Right. Okay. Um, and now we're gonna get arguments over wells.
So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been.
Oh, and just for clarification, all of these places are basically in the south. Isaac really seems to like just hanging out in the south.
Abraham his father, which the Philip.
And also remember that all of this stuff is happening during a famine. It's during a famine that it's increasing 100-fold. It's during a famine that all of this good stuff is happening. Um, and the thing that like, so, so this is the thing of like during the time. So again, so it's like during the times of trouble, during a famine, during the things where things are going bad, during death, that is whenever you stick close to God. My the example of this that I think about in my own life is the 2008 housing crisis. If for people that don't remember, when the 2008 housing crisis happened, the two biggest industries that failed were one, the housing market, and two, the automotive industry. That's why there was all of the auto bailouts. Those were the two biggest industries that were impacted, and there were massive, massive cuts, and everything was really bad, uh, really bad recession. My parents work in the housing industry. My mom's a mortgage banker, and my dad works in the auto industry. He's a mechanical engineer. 2008 and 2009 were some of the best financial years for my mom and dad. And in my opinion, that is largely because of the business practices that they engaged in. They had a history of being honest and of doing and being hardworking. My dad was consistently, prior to the '08 crisis, was consistently screwed over by American companies. And so because he was consistently screwed over by American companies, he went and sold a lot of his company's business to Japanese and Korean companies. During the automotive crash, most of the brunt went towards American companies. And so my dad actually did very good during those years because he was doing work with Toyota, with Nissan, with Honda, and Hyundai in South Korea. Because he was doing work with him, he was doing a lot better. My mom had a practice. So she was hired when my mom got hired, she was hired by a guy who they had, I forget what it was, but they had a little acronym that they called Fee Fi Fo Fum, and it stood for something, but it basically meant that you only did deals with what they called giants. And basically what they would do is they made a ton of money, the guy that my mom got hired from, because they would only do a couple of loans a month, but they got paid on commission. So what they would do is they would do massive, massive loans for really, really big, expensive houses, multi-million dollar houses. They would only do those loans. My mom did not do that. She would consistently do as many loans as she could for a lot of people, and especially difficult loans that there wouldn't be that big of gain on, but she would do a lot of them. So because of that, because she was consistently getting people that were in dire straits very good rates, and she was doing a lot of that, she had very good word of mouth advertising. And so her clients would get her a lot more work. And so during the '08 housing crisis, all of the big people that were just going after these few really big loans, they all lost their jobs because nobody was buying homes anymore. Nobody was making these big home purchases. Everybody was just sitting on what they had. The only people that were buying loans were people that were in dire straits and needed to
Mm.
make things work. And so those people were going to people like my mom. And so my mom was still getting a ton of work during '08, '09 period. And so she was doing financially very well. And she ended up being brought into what Quicken calls the recovery team. She was one of the few people doing that. And that let her be one of the top people in their company.
And that's
Right.
because she was trying to be a good person.
And it was because she was trying to be a good person. My mom definitely, like, she has a lot of faults, but she definitely sees her job as being a job where she can help people get who are in tough situations get homes,
Yeah.
and she's good at it. But I say that to emphasize in the story that I see that as them sticking to God, trusting God, and God helping them get out of that situation. And plenty of people have stories like these, right? I I, uh, I know that the Warrens talk about it a little bit because like they started the church during that time period and they didn't have a lot of money, and so switch from Rachel had to switch from doing real estate to buying and selling gold. And
Oh,
sh
wow.
she wasn't used to that, and so she went around and did a bunch of buying and selling gold, and it was basically the profits of the buying and selling gold that they put into the church, and that's how they, funded the church. Um, and so there's a lesson there in all that. But, alright, let's keep going.
Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him.
Pretty sure Esek just means, like, contention.
Mhm.
Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land."
I think Sitna, I have to bring up I'm doing this off of memory, so I might be wrong. Sitna, I think means like quarreling, and Rehoboth means like roominess, which is why the Lord has made room for us now, right? So it's the same pattern of naming that we've talked about. Um, but again, so we talked about this a little bit previously whenever we talked about Abraham digging the wells. But uh the wells are really important to the sojourners. They have important significance later on because there's a lot of wells and a lot of different stories happen by those wells. But mostly, what I see these wells are is these wells are a way of tying them to the land, right? They're ways of tying um, Abraham and his descendants to the land, right? And you can think of it as it's them connecting with the earth. And we're gonna see. I think it's in the next paragraph or so. Yeah, we're gonna see a different form of connection to the earth, which will be a connecting of heaven and earth. But this is them connecting to the earth, like it's theirs. They're establishing land. They're establishing themselves. Um, and just that is a thing that on the theme of land that as modern Christians we always forget, but we are supposed to do things to establish ourselves in the land, right? You get into a little bit of dominion theology here about like, oh, we should be in finance, we should be in all of these different things, we should be competing in these like areas and taking them over. And I agree with that. I don't agree with dominion theology whenever it says that we need to take over all of these areas and spheres in order for Jesus to come back. I don't think that that's true. Um, uh, but I do think that we are supposed to be doing that because we are supposed to be in the capacity that we have, be making the world a better place. And you can make you can make the world a better place by bringing about wells. You can make the world a better place by making good businesses, by making inroads in politics, all of these different things. You can make the land fruitful, and I do think that we're supposed to be doing that, right? You're supposed to go forth and multiply yourself, but also multiply the land that you have dominion over, right?
From there he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well.
Okay, so you have this really weird, like, interesting thing about Beersheba. One, if we go back to the Abimelech story, Abraham dug that well, Beersheba, and swore an oath with Abimelech. Because Beersheba means like well of the oath. Sheba or Shiva means like oath. It also means seven. So you have that connection between the number seven and like kind of godliness there. Um, but you have him building an altar there, and altars are places where you have mediation up to God, right? And it's usually they build them in places where they have revelation. What's the revelation that Isaac got there? The revelation is that the Lord appeared to him that same night and reiterated that covenant that already got highlighted um up above. Now, here's a question. Is that a different is this a different instance of Isaac meeting the Lord, or is it the same instance of Isaac meeting the Lord? Because it says up at the top, right? It says there's a famine in the land. He's going to go down to Gerar to the land, and the Lord appeared to him and said all this. And what he says there is different. It's a lot longer at the top than it is at the bottom. But I would make the argument that that's just a framing device, right? It's just a framing device. It's a thing that like the Bible's like, oh, I want to say this now because I'm now going to frame the next story by this. And that's what I said earlier whenever I was like, again, the structure of this chapter is really weird because like you have above him saying this thing, and then he says it again down low. Is that because God said it two times, or is it because the writer put roughly the same thing in two different places? Once the first time as a framing of the entire story, and the second time to say, oh, that by the way is when it happened chronologically,
Mm.
right? And I kind of think that it was just the one time that the Lord spoke to Isaac, but this is where it happened chronologically. Because I don't really see the need for the Lord to say the same thing twice. So I tend to think that that's what's going on, but I don't know. So we're gonna keep going because I'm taking too long with a lot of this.
When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzzath his advisor and Phicol the commander of his army.
So there's and Phicol, the commander of his army. Why would Phicol be a hereditary title? I don't know. Phicol just means strong, so maybe like
He was strong.
maybe he was strong, something like that. I don't know. But there doesn't seem to be any indication that it's a different Feikal. So I would just think that it's the same one.
Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you?"
So it's really interesting that Isaac has this line about you hate me and you sent me away from you. um based off of the fact that they had asked him to go away because he was so successful. Um it, it's I find that to be strange because Isaac is the one that kind of was the one playing a trick on them. And so it's like, Isaac, you're being a little bit hypocritical here. Like you were the one that lied to them and we're trying to like trick them and all this stuff. Uh don't be so mad that they asked you that after they did all of these nice things to you that they let you stay in the land and all of this stuff. Um uh I don't think you got to be so mean to say that they hate you, but
Said, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths. And Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. That same day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." He called it Shibah. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day.
so it's one of the things that's very interesting to me is because we already had a story about why Beersheba is called Beersheba, right? But it's actually the same story. The patriarch makes an oath of peace with the Philistines. Um and so it's very interesting to me that basically almost everything Isaac has done in this chapter so far is just a repeat of what Abraham has already done.
Do you think there's two Beershebas?
No, there's just one Beersheba. There's not multiple.
That's very interesting.
Right.
When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah.
Okay, so that last verse comes out of nowhere, right?
Mhm.
It's very interesting that they choose to make that the last verse. Mostly they do that because the next section is all about the story of um Jacob tricking Isaac. So again, I'm going to go a little bit out of my way here and talk about why I think that verse is there. Okay? Because it seems to come out of nowhere. Okay. Why was the first story of Abraham and Abimelech placed where it was? What was the issue? Why would it have been bad for Abraham to lie about who Sarah was?
Well, I mean, it's wrong. To
But beyond just like the objective morality of the lying in this situation, like why was it where it was? What happened right after? I've already mentioned it.
Oh yeah. They slept with her.
Well,
Tried to.
but Isaac was born, right?
Oh yeah.
Right. Isaac was born, and so it was really important that no one did sleep with her, right?
So that they knew it was a legitimate.
So that they knew that it was a legitimate son, right?
Yeah.
The the thing of why these stories matter to the overarching story that's taking place throughout Genesis and throughout this is the promised line, right? The
Yeah.
preservation of the promised line is the important thing, and it's why you don't have this. It's why you don't want to have these mixings occurring, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why it's weird that this story structurally is in there at all. Because Isaac Isaac has already, like, by the time that this story comes around, Jacob and Esau are already born. Right? They've already been born. They were born last chapter. So why are we now suddenly having this story about, ooh, there was a chance that the line was possibly confused, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
Right? Like, structurally, it's weird. And that was another thing that I wanted to see if I could find anybody talking about that. And I couldn't find anybody talking about that. So I don't have too much to say. But I do think that that idea about the issue of the promised line is partially why this sentence is in there at the end of this story. Because that idea is kind of always there in the back. I think it's there in the back of the minds of the readers about what is the legitimate line. You had previously with Ishmael and Isaac, one being a legitimate son and one being an illegitimate son, right?
Yeah.
And you had this issue of which one was legitimate. With Jacob and Esau, part of the reason why I think that this story is situated after their birth is to highlight that you don't have that issue with Jacob and Esau. In the same way that I think that Isaac's name doesn't change to show that Isaac doesn't have this issue of his name needing to be changed, I think that the story is structured this way. And again, this is me speculating, so maybe I'm taking it too far. I think that the story is structured this way to highlight that there is no issue with Esau being legitimate or not. There's no issue of whether or not Esau is legitimate. Esau is a 100% legitimate son of the promise. But that is merely physical. He is not the son of the promise in a different way. Okay? And this, in my opinion, is a part of what the Bible is doing here is because remember, we take in modern times, we take so easily the jump between the spiritual and the physical. We make that jump of being like, oh, he's not talking about physically here, he's talking about spiritually here. People in the Old Testament would not have made that jump as easily as we do. They would not have done that. And so instead, I think they're taking little steps to move along that line. And the Jacob and Esau story is a little step along that line. And it's going to culminate later. You're going to get verses later on throughout Hebrew scriptures, namely, and so this is why I wanted to so it's in Malachi 1 Malachi 1, 2 through 3. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you ask, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, the Lord says, yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated, and I have turned his mountains into a wasteland and his inheritance into the desert, and his inheritance to the desert jackals. That's in Malachi, right? In Romans, Paul's going to pick up on that and say, not only that, but Rebekah's children had one and the same father, our father Isaac. Yet before the two twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Why did God love Jacob and hate Esau? If God is love, how could he hate anyone? Okay. If you read the further context in Romans of what Paul's talking there, Paul is talking about the issue of not all Israel is Israel. Not all physical sons of Israel are the sons of the promise.
Like what Jesus said to the Pharisees.
Like what Jesus is saying, right? They are using specifically this story, right, in contrast to the difference between Isaac and Ishmael. They're not using the difference between Isaac and Ishmael to delegitimize people. What they're saying is you have legitimate physical birth, but the legitimate physical birth is not enough, is not what is required. What is required is what's up above, obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Obedience. Obedience is required. That's the thing that legitimizes the son of the promise. This should be, and this shouldn't be confused with a work salvation thing.
Yeah.
It should not be confused with the work salvation thing, because who is the son of the promise? Jacob. Jacob does plenty of things bad, right? He does plenty of things bad. It is not because Jacob is good, right? And even though it says, I hated Esau, Esau actually has a pretty good life on the whole. God blesses Esau. God does great things for Esau. He is, when it talks about God is hating him, it is not talking about Esau the person. And it's not talking about the bad things that Esau has done. It's not even talking about the short-sightedness that Esau displays in his life. It is talking about the adherence that they are going to have to, in obedience. It's talking about, are they going to stick with me? Are they going to stick with me? Are they going to show allegiance? Are they going to have allegiance? That's what it's about. Esau's descendants are not going to have allegiance to Yahweh. They're not. What is the biblical hint that they are not going to have allegiance to Yahweh? Esau took a wife from the Canaanites, from the Hittites, right? Mixed marriages. That's the signal. That's the signal that they're not going to have allegiance to Yahweh. Okay. It's marriages, right? And so I think I made my point clear, right? I'm saying that I think that the reason why this story is happening after their birth, this story is taking place after their birth to showcase that this story is not an issue on Esau's physical legitimacy, but it ends with this verse about who Esau ends up choosing to marry to showcase that decision that Esau makes to mix the marriages, to blur his identity,
To be one with someone.
to make allegiance, to blur his identity with people that don't want to identify with Yahweh. That's the reason why Yahweh does not choose them, does not choose him. Instead, he's going to choose the son that goes back to the homeland and takes a wife from his people, takes a wife from the people that will identify with Yahweh. Okay, make sense? All right. Gonna end it there. Again, if you have questions or comments, you can send them to me or leave them on the video. Also, for people that end up watching this, I put in my 2 weeks at the project that I'm on. And so next week I will also be recording. But then the following week I should be off work, and so we'll be back onto a regular schedule. Um, I will text everybody that as well. But thanks again. Stop recording. There we go.